Last we tuned in, we were on the first portion of Mark 15. And remember, the chief priest and crew were taking Jesus to Pilate, and because they pronounced that he deserved death, but they couldn't do it, and only the Romans could really accomplish that. And so now they have to convince Pilate to do the dirty work. And they tried all kinds of stuff. Pilate ends up sending, not in Mark, but in John, I believe, sending Jesus over to Herod. Chief priests were okay with that because, well, Herod killed John the Baptist. So, but Herod sends him back to Pilate, makes Pilate deal with it, and he turns Jesus over for crucifixion. He's mocked and whatnot in front of by the Roman soldiers, and then the crucifixion begins. We bring in Simon of Cyrene, who's a passerby. He was traveling from Cyrene, which I understand is quite the distance away, but he had two sons by the name of Alexander and Rufus, who are mentioned later in church history. And so it seems that they probably resettled out of Cyrene into Rome and became prominent church members in the early Roman church. Now, let's see, last week, right before we ended, Jesus was in great agony. Things were about to happen, and he truly became sin before God. And there was total separation. And he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so there was that first separation in eternity that the Godhead of Father, Spirit, and Son were separated at that time for the purpose of punishment upon our sin. So we start now in verse 35 to 38. And Dad, would you take that on, please, sir?
And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he's calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last.
Go ahead and go through 38.
And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.
Okay. A lot happening there. In 35, Skip Heitzig brought out that if Jesus was speaking Hebrew at this point when he said, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, it does sound like Elijah. And so the comment that somebody said he's calling Elijah makes a lot of sense at that point, because otherwise it's kind of just out of the blue. But if the Hebrew does sound like he's calling Elijah, and so it was just a misunderstanding, an honest misunderstanding of those that were there. Yeah, about 37, when Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, John 19:30 brings out that what he said was, and it's very important, is that it is finished. And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit, which was the moment that it was done. And everything was paid for, it's paid in full, and the moment is over. And why Mark left that out? Don't know. But it does seem like a very important part of the entire story for sure. 38, when the temple curtain was torn. The curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. I think it's the holy place. This is where God destroyed the priesthood, and the whole procedure of approaching God totally changed at that moment, whether they realized it or not. And you got to notice the passive voice was torn. So it does not say that the curtain tore. So there was an earthquake and whatnot. You could say, well, in the earthquake, the curtain tore. No, it said it was torn, which means that somebody tore it. And so obviously, who tore it but God himself? God tore the curtain and changed everything. And I believe that came from Skip Heitzig as well, much of that. So, and then 39. David, would you read 39, please, sir?
And basically, saw that in this way he breathed his last. He said, "Surely this man was the Son of God."
So this could be, this fella, this centurion, he appears later, by the way. This centurion could be the first post-crucifixion convert. He could hold that post, which is kind of neat. You'd hate to say that, well, I was one of the guys that crucified him, but maybe he could say that he was the first convert after the crucifixion. 40 and 41, Doug.
There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem.
Matthew Henry said that this Mary was the wife of Cleophas or Alphaeus, and so that's I guess it's not clear, but probably the sister of Jesus' mother, and which is kind of interesting. Which is, I thought it must be a cultural thing, because if you look at the names of her children, she, Mary, the mother of Jesus, also had a son by the name of James and a son by the name of Joseph. So I don't know if that was a common thing, but I had to look that up pretty tightly because I thought, well, those sound real familiar. I remember the story back when they thought that Jesus was kind of going nuts, and the whole family came to visit, and I had to go back to look at what the names of his brothers were, and it was close but not quite, and so I just thought that was interesting. But she appears to be his aunt anyway, if I understand it correctly. Any commentary on that? Maybe I've totally misunderstood that. Any commentary in your study Bibles? And this has no theological ramification whatsoever. It's just a rabbit I chased for a minute. So. I see Doug's worked hard at it. The other thing we can say about the women is that the women disciples seem to be the most courageous, and they followed Jesus around most everywhere. But this is the first time that Mark really mentions that there were even women disciples. And so you got to ask the question, well, why did Mark mention them now? And Mike Winger brought out that Mark needed continuity of witnesses to verify the event. And so all the male disciples, they'd scattered at this point. All that was left at the crucifixion were the females, were the women. So we'll mention the females, needed for the continuity of what actually happened. Skip Heitzig brought out that the male disciples had fled and the ladies stuck around. Even John seems to have been there earlier, but we don't know if he stuck around actually this long. But the ladies were still there. They were hanging in there. 42. Go ahead.
One of the things that I see in the previous verse there, in the 38th, it says, "And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Now that sentence is in there for a specific reason about that top to bottom there.
What do you think that is, Dan?
Well, I don't know.
Anybody else?
Maybe it was designed to not to be torn at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we studied the tabernacle and when I did the tabernacle a couple weeks ago, and a lot of the things I read and I saw, they say that they were specific in the fact that it was torn from the top to bottom because it would take in excess of 30 priests to actually hang that veil. Okay, so it would have been possible with everybody being on the ground to be able to tear it, being as big and as heavy as it was, from bottom to top. But there was no way physically possible that anybody could have gotten up there in that short of a period of time and be able to tear it cleanly like it was torn from the very top to the very bottom. It had to be a supernatural occurrence.
Okay.
I've heard that the curtain was a hand in width, so it wasn't like this thin sheer. It was from here to here thick, and so and made of all kinds of stuff put together, and so there was no way that thing was gonna rip on its own. And
it had the different materials that it was actually woven with. Okay, and then on that particular one there, it actually had gold lace woven into it for the cherubim, and they said that the weight of it would have been so heavy that it would have taken multiple people just to be able to start to tear it, let alone be able to tear it from the top to the bottom.
Yeah.
But you got to keep in mind it was 15 feet high too.
Yeah. So.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it changed everything in the way we have access to God. Changed everything. 42 and 43, we are back to dead. Already? We're wrapping this around.
And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus.
All right, we're going to step outside of Mark for just a second. David, would you mind looking up John 19, please?
What verse?
38 through 42. This expands what was just read.
After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because of the fears of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took his body away. Nicodemus, who had previously come to him at night, also came, bringing a mixture of about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen cloths with the fragrant spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified. The new tomb was in the garden, and no one had yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby.
Okay. And so that's just a little more detail. We know we bring in Joseph and we bring in Nicodemus. These guys had soft hearts, and they brought in I don't know, they really stood up, so to speak. But we go back to Mark now, 45. Doug, would you read, 44 through 47, finish that portion up.
Okay. I was surprised to hear that he should have already died. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid.
Okay. So Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. Now, what centurion do you think what centurion do you think was summoned to find out if Jesus was dead or not?
Probably the one that stuck him.
Well, I'm thinking at least may have been the same one that stuck him, but at least the one in verse 39, I figure. The one that we just saw, and when the centurion who stood facing him saw that he died in the way he did, and he breathed his last, he said that truly this man was the Son of God. Well, likely it was the same guy that Pilate summoned to find out if he was dead or not. And, like you said, Doug, I wouldn't doubt it if he was the same fellow that thrust him in the side. Tim Keller had some really good thoughts on the proof of the resurrection. Did it really happen? And there's three really good reasons for why this happened. Can you guys hear me? Because I'm getting a note that my internet's unstable.
On the part of that last phrase that you said.
The last phrase, Tim Keller has three really good reasons why the resurrection really happened. And these are very good. They were really bad reasons for back then, but super good proofs that they did happen now. And so number one, he said there's only one set of disciples that saw Jesus on the cross, saw his burial, and saw his resurrection. And who were those disciples? Who do you think they were?
Was it one of them was James?
Well, it's kind of a group of disciples, but James took off too. He was gone. What's that? Mary was part of them. So the group of women were the only set of disciples that saw Jesus on the cross and saw his burial and then saw his resurrection. So therefore, first of all, and women at that point, which was not a strong suit back then, but very strong now, women were not even allowed to be witnesses in court back then. But yet Scripture recorded that they are the only group of people that actually saw all of these events to verify that they actually happened. Case in point number two, and all this will come together in a minute. The only person in Mark that calls Jesus the Son of God is the centurion. So he's the murderer of Christ, the outsider, the ruffian, and yet he recognized and stated the truth. Third, Mark reports Joseph of Arimathea, and John reports, just as we read, that Joseph and Nicodemus took the body down and prepared it for burial. So this process was normally done by slaves and women. Men never, according to Tim Keller, men never did this. So why was it reported in that way? Simply because it happened. Why was it reported that women were the only witnesses through everything? Because it happened. Why was it reported that the centurion, the murderer himself, said he was the Son of God? Because it happened. If you're making up a story, you're not going to say that the most unreliable people in that society would report that it happened. You would say something like, the chief priest decided that Jesus was the Son of God, and everything would be rosy. But instead, what really happened was that the women reported that Jesus was buried and resurrected. And what really happened was that the murderer reported that he was the Son of God. And that these guys, Joseph and Nicodemus, men, actually prepared Jesus for burial and laid him to rest. And you wouldn't report these things if you're trying to hide something. So why was it reported? Because it happened. and those are some very strong reasons. So obviously the story didn't bode well back then because the witness thing was not strong. But in our society, we look back on it and realize that it would have only been reported in that way because it happened that way. But that's primarily it. We'll leave it there this evening. Start in at chapter 16 next week.